Hello and good morning. Thank you for everybody joining us today. My name is Madeline. I'm with Pacific Coffee Research, and this presentation is a coffee scoring systems panel discussion. So in this webinar, the Hawaii Coffee Association has invited sensory professionals to speak on various quality scoring systems used within the coffee industry. We generally found that there was some confusion behind the varying methodology across these different systems that we will be presenting today. And so we thought a panel presentation and discussion would help explain these differences, similarities, and kind of the best application for each one that will be spoken about today. Each presenter has been asked to explain one scoring system, the target market for that system, along with various benefits and weaknesses of that scoring system presented. So our panel today includes Brittany Horn of Pacific Coffee Research, Kim Westerman of Coffee Review, and Shawn Steiman of Cafea Consulting. Britt will start us off by presenting on the HCA CQI scoring system, followed by Kim, who will be explaining Coffee Review's scoring system and process. And then we'll finish off with Shawn, who will be breaking down his yet-to-be-named scoring system that he developed on based on intensity scales. So we've seen each of these evaluation systems used in Hawaii coffee, which is why they were specifically chosen for today's panel. Just at the end of the session, we'll have time for Q&A. And I also welcome each of the presenters today to ask their own questions amongst each other at the end of each presentation. So thank you for joining us, and we'll get started here soon. And I'm going to pop off while our presenters take over. Oh, and in the chat box, you can ask questions throughout the whole session, and I'll answer as best I can. And if I don't have an answer, I will make sure we take note of that to ask our presenters at the end. And Britt, it's yours.
See if you are on mute. There we go.
Hi, everyone. Now you can hear me okay. You can see the presentation. I uploaded a couple of handouts as well that I welcome you to use at your own will. I do also recommend that everyone takes a look at the flavor wheel, as I'll reference that later on in our presentation today, okay? As Madeline said, my name is Brittany. I'm a co-owner with Madeline here at Pacific Coffee Research in Kona. And I'll be presenting on the Specialty Coffee Association Coffee Quality Institute cupping methodology and protocol. Let's see. So the formal method of coffee cupping as presented by Specialty Coffee Association originally sought to detect defects and identify consistency of products, but it's evolved over the years to create a system and language that became globally recognized and is used today as a means of communication across the supply chain. In the mid-1970s, a woman named Erna Knudsen worked as a coffee trader and coined the term specialty coffee in an attempt to create some division for customers who were seeking these higher quality coffees beyond the commercial homogenized products that were being traded. And shortly after, in 1982, the Specialty Coffee Association of America, which is a 501c3 nonprofit, was organized by a small group of individuals seeking a common forum to discuss issues and set quality standards for specialty coffee trade In 1984, Ted Lingle, who was the executive director of the Specialty Coffee Association of America, published the Coffee Taster's Handbook, which was the first publication that outlined specific guidelines for cupping coffee. In 1995, Specialty Coffee Association of America established the Specialty Coffee Institute. It was a committee within the organization that set up as the scientific center for the evaluation of coffees and price stability for producers, whose research could be funded by tax-deductible contributions from members and conference revenues. By 1998, Specialty Coffee Institute changed its name to Coffee Quality Institute. They split from Specialty Coffee Association of America and changed their mission to working internationally to improve the quality of coffee and the livelihoods of those who produce it. In 1999, cuppings were being used at Cup of Excellence competitions, leading the HCA, actually at the time, Specialty Coffee Association of America, to publish its first scoring system. Additionally, the Q Coffee program was developed in tandem by Coffee Quality Institute as a formalized method of cupping and scoring coffee based on HCA cupping and scoring protocol. In 2002, a pilot program was funded through a grant from the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the first classes were taught at their Long Beach headquarters. It's here that students were put through a series of 22 individual tests over the course of 3 to 4 days to measure their sensory skills, calibrate, and maintain consistency in scoring. By 2015, Coffee Quality Institute had trained 6,000 cuppers worldwide, certified more than 3,500 Q Arabica graders worldwide in over 60 countries, and the number keeps growing. Additionally to this, calibration must be done every 3 years to keep Q graders qualified for recertification. And if this time lapses, the individual must take the entire exam program again. Okay. So this is just an image of the evolution of the form. I know there was a form prior to the one that's at the very top, but I could not find it anywhere. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but this is just a kind of general evolution of the different systems, or of the system. The one at the very bottom is the most current, up-to-date scoring form. Today, our industry still uses cuppings in the same ways as merchants did 100 years or so ago, where they were basically making a decision to purchase a coffee or not, assess a coffee's characteristics. But they have also created now specific guidelines for training protocol, methodology, and again, calibration through the CQI Q Grader program. So Ted Lingle defined coffee cupping as a method used to systematically evaluate the aroma and taste characteristics of a sample of beans. As I just mentioned, the system is standardized. There's a language that we use to aid in clear communication between the cuppers and the rest of the supply chain. There's standardized protocol to maintain consistency in results, and standardized calibration and training through the Coffee Quality Institute for licensing Q Arabica graders. So I'm going to talk a little bit about preparation. This includes roasting. So everything that goes into the preparation and the system that we use when we're cupping coffee is standardized. So for roasting, you have a specific roasting standard. Just in general, it's a light to light medium roast level. There are very specific parameters that I'm not going to go into. The time at which you're supposed to cup the coffees after roasting is 8 to 24 hours. Coffees are to be stored in an airtight container until ground. The environment, you must have a well-lit, clean, odor-free, quiet space. You have a certain parameter for the table height. It has to be a comfortable and controlled temperature and humidity, and there must be limited distractions. This goes in depth, even with room measurements, the furniture that can be in the room, the color of the room, or your space is certified as acceptable for the Coffee Quality Institute standards. A representative is sent out to examine the space and make sure it's up to their standards. Cupping tables, generally for 6 people, have to have a certain size, again, a certain height as well. They also have to accommodate people of different heights, and then we go into coffee measurements. So, not in general. The optimum coffee to 1 to 18. So that's 1 gram of coffee to 18 grams of water. There's a grind standard as well for the coffee. Generally coarse, between 70 to 75% of the coffee should pass through a size 20 mesh sieve. There is a water standard. You can see what is it called? The golden cup standard for specific measurements on water, but in general, 125 to 175 TDS. Clean, odor-free, pH between 7.0 and 7.4. And then the water temperature that you're going to be using as you begin the cupping has to be between 200 degrees Fahrenheit to 203 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's 92.2 to 94.4 Celsius when we pour on the ground. Coffee tools. So we have cupping spoons. Cupping spoons have to be a certain size. They have to hold 4 to 5 milliliters of coffee and should also be made of a non-reactive metal. The cupping vessel should be of tempered glass or ceramic material. They should hold between 7 and 9 fluid ounces of water with a specific top diameter of 3 to 3.5 inches. You also have to be prepared with timers, a scale, and spittoons so that you can spit after you ingest the coffee or aspirate the coffee. So the general preparation for coffee, and that's outlined in the PCR HCA Basics infographics that our employee Lauren created, kind of goes over what these general guidelines are for preparation. But the first thing that we do is we weigh the coffee in individual cups as whole bean. There's 5 cups per flight of coffee. So that's 1 sample of coffee. We work with 5 cups of the same coffee. Within that 1 cup, you measure out, for us, we use 12 grams of coffee in each one of the cups. And only after each cup is weighed out, then we grind the coffee, okay? This is to ensure that we're not going to take a mass amount of coffee, put it into a grinder, and then redistribute. We want to make sure that the coffee that's in the cup is representative of the sample that we're going to be analyzing. This is to ensure that there is uniformity and consistency between the cups. After the coffee is ground and there's a purge between each one of the different samples that we're analyzing, we'll evaluate the dry fragrance. The third step is that we're going to pour our calibrated water into each one of the cups, and we steep the coffee, being really careful not to hit the table, allow the coffee to steep and brew for 3 to 5 minutes. There's a bit of a generalized time frame, but whatever we do it consistently. Okay, so if you in your own space are using 3-minute brew time, that's fine. Just make sure you do it every single time. And that's one of the most important aspects of this methodology is consistency. At that point, we're going to break the crust and we evaluate the aroma. And again, I'm going to go over each one of these characteristics shortly. We skim the surface to remove any grinds that are left floating, and then we continue to let the coffee cool until it's about 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, being consistent. After that, we are going to spoon out a sample from each one of the cups and start filling out the form. And we continue this until the coffee is cooled to about 70 degrees. So this is a picture of the form. I'm going to go over what each one of these boxes represents and how they are defined. The general quality scale. So we're working with what we are assuming is going to be specialty coffee. So we start the scoring on the horizontal line, the horizontal tick marks. Start at 6. So anything from a 6 to 6.75 we define as good. Anything from a 7 to a 7.75 we would define as very good. 8 to 8.75 would be considered excellent, and very rarely we see 9s. From 9 to 9.75 we would see outstanding. So we're always scoring the coffees in 0.25 points, okay, increments. I'm going to keep this slide up while we talk about each one of these categories. So fragrance and aroma are scored together. Fragrance, as I said before, is observed after the coffee is ground. These are aromatics released from ground coffee and inhaled through the nose. Aroma are aromatics released from ground coffee beans that have been saturated with water and then inhaled through the nose. And then we come up with a score. You see at the bottom, the vertical lines are measurements of intensity of the dry fragrance and the wet aroma, also defined as the break. Moving on to flavor. Flavor is the coffee's principal character, the mid-range notes between the first impressions given by the coffee's aroma and acidity to its final aftertaste. Flavor is combined impression of all gustatory sensations and retronasal aromas that go from the mouth and the nose, go into the mouth and the nose. The score given for flavor should account for intensity, quality, and complexity of the combined taste and aroma experienced in the coffee. Flavor evaluation is observed after the coffee is dropped below 71 C or 160 degrees to avoid scalding. The aftertaste is the duration of attributes sensed after the coffee has been swallowed. Okay. Acidity, HCA defines as brightness when favorable or sour when unfavorable, but the highest scores for acidity should be given for refined, complex, and structured acidity. If the acidity of a coffee reminds you a quality or food or beverage, particularly fresh fruit, it warrants generally a high score. Lower scores are generally given for sour, harsh, or dull acidity, or if the acidity is very overpowering or on the adverse, extremely lacking in intensity. Again, there is an intensity measurement as well for the acidity. And then moving on to body. Body is based on tactile mouthfeel or physical properties of the coffee perceived on the surface of the tongue. Most samples with heavy intensity of body may also receive a high score, but high scores for weight require a mouthfeel that feels comfortable and thirst quenching. High scores can be awarded to coffees with less weight if this element harmonizes with other qualities in the cup. Lower scores are given if the body is just unacceptably thin or watery. And moving on, I'm going to skip the 3 boxes. I'll come back to those. So going below the uniformity section to balance. Balance is how all the various aspects of flavor, aftertaste, acidity, and body of the coffee sample work together. The balance score would be high scores for balance depend on olfactory, gustatory, and tactile sensations working well together in a harmonious way. Okay. And then the very last quality measurement is overall. The overall scoring aspect is meant to reflect the holistically integrated rating of the sample. And really it's how well did the coffee cool? So we're testing the coffee about over half an hour, and we're seeing how well it's maintained its cup quality throughout that half hour. So now I'm going to move back over in the form to uniformity, clean cup, and sweetness. And you'll notice that these are just indicators of just a checked box. So presence or not presence of uniformity, presence or not presence of clean cup, presence or no presence of sweetness. I'm going to go back into detail as well on these three different sections, three different attributes of the form when we talk about defects as well. But just to define them, uniformity is defined as consistency of flavor of all of the different samples of the cup. So as I said, we're working with 5 different coffees, or 5 different cups of the same coffee, and we want to make sure that each one of them is consistent. Clean cup refers to a lack of interfering negative impressions from the first ingestion to the final aftertaste. And this is generally associated with presence of defect in the cup. Sweetness is defined as fullness of flavor, as well as any obvious sweetness, in its perception is the result of presence of certain carbohydrates. Again, sweetness is generally going to be, is there sweetness present? Yes. Is it not present? No. Generally, if it's not present, it is because there's a detectable defect in one of the cups. Okay. So this is what one sample of coffee will look like on your table. The cups are numbered consistently every time, starting from the left to the right in this M form. You have cup 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And this is how they're associated on the form as well. Okay, so we make sure that when we're talking about a defect in cup number 3, we're all talking about the same cup. We're not saying, we're not numbering them any differently. Okay. So defects are considered negative or off flavors that detract from the quality of the coffee. Defects must be classified as a taint or a fault and then identified or described. Okay. My friend and colleague Zoe Thorson, who's Director of Education at Royal Coffee New York and previously worked here in Hawaii, she does a great job of talking about the waterfall effect of present defects in the cup. So starting with uniformity, do all the cups taste the same? It's just as simple as that. And if any cup is different, that cup is marked on the sheet and 2 points are reduced from the total scoring potential. If a box is checked, you move on to clean cup. If nothing is checked, then the coffee receives a 10 for this category. Clean cup and sweetness would also be given a score of 10. If there is lacking consistency in one of the cups, is that non-uniform cup identifiable as having a known defect? Or in other words, can you identify that defect? If the answer is yes, then the appropriate box is checked, and the defect is identified under the notes section of the scoring form. 2 points are subtracted from clean cup. In sweetness, has that known defect rendered this cup unpalatable? For this box to be checked, the coffees must have an intense fault level defect. For taints, these are off flavors that is noticeable but not completely overwhelming. If we go back to the form, you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner that you would mark the intensity of the defect and how many cups it's present in. And that would also be reduced from the final score of the coffee. Again, if it's a fault, which we have defined as an off flavor that's observed both in the aroma, fragrance aroma aspects, as well as the flavor aspects of the sample, it's generally overwhelming and generally will render the sample unpalatable. This is a sample of a completed cupping form. In case it's difficult to read, I will kind of go over it, and this is where you can reference your flavor wheel. So the first sample, 3897, we have a coffee that scores really, really well with a final score of 86.25. You'll notice that the language that's used to talk about these coffees span a wide range of the flavor wheel. So they're not just focused on one characteristic of the flavor wheel. You have fruitiness, you have florality, you have sweetness, you have complex acidity. You notice that there's two different acidities that are identified, and you end up with a high score. 3824, the next sample down, is a sample that we are showcasing defect presence. You see that in uniformity, there were 2 cups that lacked uniformity, but only one of those cups, cup number 3, there was an identifiable defect, as well as impeding with the presence of sweetness. So that coffee lost 8 points overall, just because of lacking uniformity and defect presence. And then it reduces another 2 points because of the presence of defect that you see outlined in the bottom right-hand corner. So where a coffee would have scored a 73.25, we're now taking an additional 2 points off for the presence of defect, and you wind up with a 71.25. The sample on the very bottom is a great representation of specialty coffee as well, or a very good representation of specialty coffee. You'll notice as well that you have clear descriptors, a lot of clarity in the cup. However, those descriptors are pretty limited to sweetness characteristics, a little bit of fruitiness, but it's not as complex as the coffee that you see presented at the very top. This system is generally used by pretty much everyone in the supply chain at this point. In the beginning, it was really just used for buyers making yes or no purchasing decisions based off of detectable defects. But it became a means of communication to producers as well. So by offering a score on their coffee, you're able to give them some tangible feedback on ways to maybe improve the product. Producers now use this system for processing decisions, variety selection. So by cupping at their own, on their own farms, within their own QC panel, if they have one, they're able to make decisions about how they'd like to move forward with a specific coffee. Buyers also use this tool. It's again, as a standard communication with producers, but processors may use the system to make a decision on whether or not they'd like to buy a coffee. Importers and roasters use this system to decide whether or not they accept a sample, for example, before a coffee is sent. An importer or a roaster might request a pre-purchase sample, and they'll cup the coffee, they'll give it a score, and then once their lot arrives, they'll cup the coffee again as kind of an assurance that this is the same coffee, or that there wasn't any mishap along the way when the coffee was in transit to them, or that they were sent the right product. And then consumers also use this system. There's a company actually these days that's called 90 Plus Coffees, and they use that name really as a means to target a certain audience of people that know what that means, and that they can appeal to them by only selecting coffees perhaps that score 90 plus. Whether or not I agree with that is another conversation. But consumers use it as a way as well to maybe have an appeal about trying a certain coffee if they know what the score is. There are certainly advantages and disadvantages to the system. standardized calibration is great. The fact that the CQI exists for a training tool and a calibration tool, and it's so widely used around the world is excellent. This program is comprehensive. It forces people into the system that continuously calibrates them so long as they'd like to keep their Q grader license. Again, this is a globally accepted scoring system that's been used for a couple of decades now. And so we've developed actually a language that surpasses barriers. I mentioned before purchase insurance for pre-purchase and then acceptance of the lot. And market discovery. So we had this is kind of ties between both an advantage and disadvantage of this system. In our last cupping competition, there was a coffee that we consider polarizing coffees. And this kind of talks about the limits of how a coffee should taste, okay? Our Q panel was comprised of 3 American-based coffee drinkers and 3 Japanese-based coffee drinkers. And if I tell you that there was almost a 6-point difference, where calibration is usually within a 0.75 point difference between Q graders, there was about a 6-point difference between the American Q graders and the Japanese Q graders. But the positive of this experience, while it was very difficult for them to, the flavor that existed in the coffee was really reminiscent for the Japanese drinkers of a candy that's created. It's a fermented sugar candy that's well known and loved in Kyoto. And so for them, that was extremely exciting. And then for the American Q graders, they really didn't know what to do with the coffee. It was unusual. It was like they'd never tasted, but it was a great example of market discovery. So this coffee still has a home. Just because American Q graders were not necessarily primed to understand this flavor and how to score this coffee, it really opened up a market for that this coffee would do really well if marketed to Japanese coffee drinkers. And then World Coffee Research has become much more involved with the Specialty Coffee Association over the last decade. Or several decades, but really working in sensory. And they created the most recent flavor wheel, which you now have a copy of. But Madeline will also post a few links for references, and one of those is the sensory lexicon that was created by World Coffee Research. And this is a means for continuous calibration in your own setting. So I highly recommend taking a look at that document. It's free. And then some other disadvantages of the system. The defects have a huge impact on score. And they also potentially have a huge impact on the price of coffee and how price is determined. It's a lengthy process. So from all of the preparation that goes into it, as well as the actual formal cupping procedure, it takes about 45 minutes to an hour from tasting the coffee to coming back with the Q graders and calibrating your scores. So that's just for, let's say, a table of 6 coffees. It takes about an hour. And I mentioned before, it's limited by standards of how a coffee should taste. We have this kind of defined 80 points or above is specialty coffee, how it should generally taste: clean, sweet, defect-free, presence of acidity. But there's so many incredible advancements in the industry these days with processing techniques that oftentimes the system really does not know what to do, how to score those coffees. But any adjustments that are necessary for the standards of global calibration and how we talk about this idea of how a coffee should taste really should happen using this form. because it's the most common method that's used worldwide, and it's a really easy starting point. And the form, like I said before, has already gone through an evolution and should continue to go through that. There is also an element of subjectivity. So while we talked about the calibration process and going through the Q grader program, olfactory sensory science is limited by how we're feeling, psychological impacts, physiological impacts on our systems. And so when we're having a really bad day or we are sick, we are not prime specimen for critiquing coffee. So there is still an element of subjectivity in the form that I'm sure Shawn will get into in a little bit. So I think that's about all I have, and then we'll have Q&A. I'm over my time, but yeah, thank you so much. There's my email address at the bottom, our website, and then, like I said, please feel free to take the handouts and check out the resources that we've provided for you. Thank you. I think Kim is up.
And there's one question here just from Sharon that I'm going to bring up before we head over to Kim. Is there discussion regarding SCA scoring about how high scores are created mostly by scoring high across all categories? Though some varieties may be the top of their game, but not hit highest on all categories. So Sharon, if I'm understanding that correctly, you're asking about how the scoring system requires a coffee to perform well across all of the categories in order to be awarded a high score in general, where sometimes it may score high and really high in one and not so great in the other, and how it kind of ends up being, you know, an average coffee. I don't really know if there's very much discussion on that in changing that in any way. Again, Britt mentioned that there's some, you know, there's definitely some room, there's some spaces for improvement in this. Some categories vary by variety. Yep, and this is something that we actually talk about, that this scoring system does not award some weird varieties, quote unquote weird varieties, right? And so those are the holes in how can we evaluate a coffee? The phrase that we use here at PCR is, how do we evaluate a coffee that doesn't fit inside the box? You know, and how can we still award it by being a good coffee without necessarily fitting inside this box? Bourbon versus the Typica. I think this scoring system works really well for both of those varieties. Yeah. And let's move on to Kim then, if that's okay. That seems, we'll get you started over here, Kim. Go ahead.
Aloha, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Can everybody hear me? Cool. I'm here in Berkeley, California, a few hours later than you all. And thank you, Britt, for going over in such great detail the whole SCA CQI process, because Coffee Review actually uses all of those protocols to the letter. But our scoring system is very, very different. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that today. I have been working with Coffee Review for nearly 5 years as a cupper, and I'm also the managing editor. So I'm responsible for writing most of the content on the site, as well as cupping all the coffees that come in from all over the world. The Coffee Review was founded in 1997 by Kenneth Davids and Ron Walters, and both of those folks are still involved in the daily operations of Coffee Review. And basically the main difference between the Coffee Review scoring system and the system that Britt just went through in detail is that coffee review scores are tailored exclusively for a consumer audience. So when you think about on the scoring sheet that Britt just showed you all, the first coffee that scored 86 something, that's an exceptional score for that rating system. But many consumers unfamiliar with that system might see that score and say, 86, that's like a B in school, right? 90 and above is an A. So that would be, not great, but better than average. And so the coffee review scoring system is really designed in a way very similar to Wine Spectator, if you're familiar with that publication. And we can debate the merits of that publication. I think it's caused a lot of trouble in the wine industry in different ways. But the coffee review system uses more of that 100-point scale. So we use the full breadth of that scale. And I'll get into some of the details of that a little bit later. Just want to give you a little bit of an overview of our process. So in terms of the consistency of the protocols, you might remember a few minutes ago, Britt giving you a range of choices for things like what temperature to pour the water at, how long to brew the coffee. Our choice for that is 203 degrees Fahrenheit is where we pour the water consistently, and we brew for 4 minutes. Other than these decisions, the process is exactly the same as the process Britt described. All of our tastings are conducted blind, and what we're really trying to get at is how will consumers receive this coffee? What will consumers think of this coffee? And that's a big question, and it's a subjective question. There are 3 of us at the lab cupping on a daily basis. Kenneth Davids, the co-founder of Coffee Review, Jason Sarley, who, like me, is a Q grader. And since the pandemic quarantine, we've actually been cupping remotely. And so that's caused some challenges that we've worked through. And the main challenge is how time consuming it is to do that. But we have figured out how to do it. And it's nice to have 3 cuppers because we can always resolve our differences and talk through any discrepancies. It's also interesting because we are 3 different generations, actually. Won't get into the nitty gritty of that, but so three different cuppers, 3 different generations, different kinds of training in coffee. So the demographic for the publication is changing rapidly. Just in the 5 years that I've been with the publication, we've seen our submissions from Taiwan in particular, but also other Asian countries go way, way up. I think now maybe 30% of our samples come from Taiwan. Big scene there. And they're very tapped into what we're doing, which is really exciting. About 64% of site visitors last year were from the US, 34 and Canada, 34% from other countries. And our readership is changing too. In the beginning, it was really all consumers looking for great coffee to drink. Now, we don't have specific data on this, but we get a lot of traffic from industry professionals, and a lot of roasters visit our site just to keep up with current trends. They send in their coffees to see how they measure up. This year, we anticipate having at least 1 million unique site visitors from more than 200 countries and all of the 50 US states. So that's also pretty cool. This next slide is an overview of the sensory values that coffee review embraces. And these are really not in any way contradictory to the evaluative preferences that Britt described in the HCA method. So, for example, sweetness is better than bitterness, and juiciness is better than astringency. We also tend to value really smooth bodied, viscous coffees more than thin or watery mouthfeels. We value complexity over simplicity. In terms of aftertaste, we appreciate a long flavor saturated finish as opposed to a short dry finish. And it's really a lot more complicated than this little chart makes it seem, in particular with the category of acidity. So, and I wish I had a form to show you. Madeline asked me to bring a form, and we're not trying to hide our form at all, but the PDF that I have is so outdated. We really just use it for writing down notes and category scores. So it's not that useful. I'm going to show you our categories here in a second. But acidity is really complicated because we noticed in our conversations a couple of years ago about our own sensory biases. We noticed that we weren't giving high scores to coffees that were maybe a little bit darker roasted or that had acidity that didn't really pop. And so we actually made a huge change in our form after they'd been doing it for something like 17, maybe 17 years. We changed the category of acidity to structure. Actually, it's structure/acidity. And what that allows us to do is to think about structure in terms of basic tastes. So we can evaluate, is this coffee sweet? Is it sweet and tart? Is it sweet and savory? Is it umami leaning? Is it salty? Is it bitter? And when we have something to say about acidity, oh, my cat came in, sorry. When we have something to say about acidity, we can say it in that category of structure, and we'll still reward a coffee for having a really juicy, vibrant, lively, engaging acidity. But we can also give a high score to a coffee, for example, that has a gentle, round acidity, but that is deeply complex in terms of its sweet tartness or sweet savoriness or layers or various kinds of depth. And I, for one, really appreciate that flexibility. So that's a really big change that we made. So in terms of understanding how coffee review works with producers and roasters, I think it's important to know that when we publish a review, it is we only publish reviews of production roasted coffees in retail packaging that consumers can access. The only exception to that is if a coffee is not available retail, but it's available wholesale. Customers can get it in that form. We do evaluate green coffees and coffees that are sample roasted as experiments. But what we offer for people who send those coffees in are private assessments. We don't publish those scores. So we don't really assign any sort of value to green coffees that we sample roast, that we publish scores on, because what we want to look at is how the roaster is taking that green coffee and transforming it. So we might actually, it's very common that we would get 3 of the exact same coffee, green coffee, 3 samples in 1 month, roasted by 3 different roasters. And those coffees can score different scores. It's fascinating how much the roaster's imprint on the green coffee changes our sensory evaluation of it. So that's something that is important to know. Also, in the interest of complete transparency, when a roaster sends us a retail roasted coffee for review, obviously we cup it blind. We don't know what we're tasting at the time, but that roaster has actually paid for a review service. Because we cup it blind, we are not in any way biased in terms of what's in that bag, but it gives the roaster the power to decide whether or not to publish that score. So if you look at the coffee review website, you're not going to see a lot of bad reviews. You're not going to see a lot of crappy coffees reviewed on that website, because we don't go and seek out all coffees at all levels to evaluate. We work with roasters who are interested in having their coffee evaluated, and then we give it our best, most honest blind assessment, and then they decide whether or not to publish that score. So it's no surprise that, if a coffee bombs, you will never find it on our website. If a coffee does well, we will publish that review, and that's why you see largely 90 and above scores on the site. And again, that 90 is not like the SCA 90. There's really no mathematical correlation between a coffee review score and an SCA CQI score, but we have tried to actually figure out the math of it, and there's some anecdotal correlation. But typically, I would guess that 86 coffee that Britt referenced earlier might score 92 in a coffee review assessment, perhaps. That's sort of the wheelhouse of the math there. So these are our sensory values, and we're challenged all the time because we taste everything in the universe, really. We taste everything. We taste the weirdest coffees, the most classic coffees, the most experimental coffees. We taste everything. And this is really challenging in terms of trying to fit it into any sort of system. But our goal, as I said, is always to celebrate really great coffee that consumers are gonna love. So again, this is sort of a repeat of something I said earlier. Scores are calibrated to run parallel to consumer wine ratings, not to Q scores. For this reason, coffee review ratings are usually higher than Q scores. And a little note that when we do a free cupping, we do a free cupping almost every month on a certain theme, and roasters can just send in their coffees and get them scored for free, and we publish the highest of those scores. In those groupings, we really only tend to publish about 25% of the samples submitted. So that gives you a sense of the ratio there. That's not always the case, but it is pretty much the average ratio. So I'm going to show you our review structure. And again, this is where I would show you our form. It's like in a 11 by 14 document, and it just was impossible to even duplicate. But these are the categories. Our scoring system is much, much simpler than SCA and CQI. Honestly, I had a little PTSD watching Britt go through that, because I've done my Q certification twice, and I re-upped, and it really was a little bit traumatic, to tell you the truth. The coffee review system is really, really simple in terms of scoring. We evaluate coffees based on aroma. So when we break the crust, we evaluate the aroma. We look at structure/acidity, which I discussed earlier. We look at body or mouthfeel, which we also talked about. And then we look at aftertaste or finish. And that's it. We start with a base score of 50. And then each of these 5 categories is worth 10 points. So if a coffee gets all 8s in all 5 categories, that would be a score of 90. All 9s would be a score of 95. This review here is one I just wrote a couple of weeks ago and just went up on the site. This is actually a coffee, a Ka'u Giant Margohipe from Big Island Coffee Roasters. And you can see that the category scores, 9 in aroma, 9 in structure, 9 in body, 9 in flavor, and 8 in finish, add up to 94. Then we really try to focus. So the SCA CQI sheet leaves very little room for words. You can write down, oh, apricot or pipe tobacco, but really it's numerically driven. The coffee review sheet is a bunch of white space for language. And so we usually give readers about 5 descriptors for each coffee. And those might be fruits, flowers, aromatic woods, any number of things. Really, the vocabulary is limitless. Really, we can call it like we see it, and that's really pleasing for me, who was actually trained as a poet, to be able to use whatever language I want to describe the sensory realm of coffee. I want to talk just briefly. I don't want to take up too much more time. I was asked to think about the strengths and weaknesses of this system. So I would say that one of the strengths is that we taste absolutely everything out there. If there's a coffee I haven't tasted, I would be surprised. I feel very fortunate to be able to say that. And we really do try to assess a coffee based on what it's trying to do. So in answering that audience member's question earlier, we wouldn't try to get like a natural processed Caturra to act like a washed processed Bourbon. Just a few weeks ago, we gave a 93 score in a blind cupping to a Liberica coffee, not even an Arabica, a Liberica coffee actually from Costa Rica. You can see it on our website. It was roasted by Miguel Meza, who I'm sure a lot of you know from Hawaii and Paradise Coffee Roasters. And that was an amazing experience to be able to honor what is happening in the realm of non-Arabica coffees that Miguel is so great about hunting down. I think, of course, we recognize exemplars of classic coffees too. That is something that we're also really keen on doing, because those things, the notions of classics, are changing all the time. So another strength, I think, is that we're always thinking about what consumers might enjoy. So we're able to state certain caveats like, well, if you like really fruit forward coffees, you'll like this. Or if you, by implication, if you hate them, don't buy this coffee. We're able to kind of take readers where they want to go. I think one weakness in my estimation is that we haven't really found a way to get consensus on coffees that are so outside the box that our standard evaluative categories don't apply. We tend to let the person on the team who has fallen in love with a coffee to just run with it. And we might think they're crazy, but we're going to let them do that because they're really passionate about a particular sort of style. So it's really not objective at that point. It's more about celebrating what we find that we think consumers will also really like. Yeah, that's about all I have. I don't want to crunch Shawn's time. Thank you all for listening to my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks for that breakdown of how that system all works. Are there any questions? We had some questions about just, how cuppers kind of cleanse their palate in between coffees and in between tables and stuff. And that was answered in the chat box. If anybody didn't see it, it is pretty common for cuppers to have just water nearby if they feel like they need to cleanse their palate. But what is I think a practice across all of these systems is that we're not actually drinking the coffee, we're aspirating and spitting. Correct me if any of your systems do something different, but the goal for that is to not have it in your retronasal, so that hopefully that doesn't linger in your system, and so that that doesn't affect what you're tasting next. So yeah, but it is common to have some water nearby, and then in between tables, it's common to have some snacks as well. I personally get very hungry when I cup coffee, and so I'm always snacking in between tables. And so, yeah. Is there any other questions? How do you calibrate? Oh, yeah. So how do you calibrate to the coffee review cupping system as a team?
Came actually 5 years ago without any coffee experience. And so I had sensory training and other stuff like wine and olive oil. It takes a while, but and so Jason, I guess, has been working with Ken for, I want to say 9 years, maybe 10, I'm not sure. But when I entered that sort of duo, they welcomed me into their sort of world of language, and we calibrated over time. And I think it took, honestly, I would say it took 6 months, maybe longer, cupping with them every single day. And it just happened by process of, it was an inductive process, just over and over and over again. And we have a shared vocabulary. When I sometimes know what Jason is thinking. I know if I say blueberry, he's probably going to say raspberry, because we look at berries differently. But we just have gotten into each other's ways of approaching these coffees. And it's really challenging when we bring in a third cupper, which we often do for reports, because we have to be challenged by their perceptions, which are completely different. And I always welcome those opportunities, because it keeps us from getting too sort of staid in our approach. But that's not to say that we always agree, but we do have a shared vocabulary and a shared sense of values around the coffees that we like.
Personal approach than the SEA CQI system, where you all, it seems your team just really gets to know each other very well over time, versus here's the system, here's how you use it, go ahead and go do it. You all kind of just a lot together. And I know that that's a big part of what you do in coffee review as well, is there's a lot of that post discussion.
Right.
With each other as they are tasting coffees, or is it totally separate so that nobody's accidentally affecting anybody's perception?
Oh, yeah, I should have mentioned that. When we're all three, well, it's different now that we're doing things remotely, actually. But in the regular world of daily life, we are all around a round cupping table, and we are all cupping blind. And after we hit that first coffee and make our notes on aroma and assign the aroma category a score, we talk about aroma descriptors. We do not give scores. We do not reveal our scores at that time, but we talk about our descriptors, so we can see easily where each other is going, right? Our descriptors reveal whether we're heading positive or negative on a coffee, but we don't talk about scores. We do share all of our descriptors on aroma. Then we go back into our own private Idahos, and we cup through the coffees separately, and we share scores and remaining descriptors at the end. So the only thing we we get on the same page around, or at least try to, is after the break.
If there aren't any more questions right now, we'll go ahead and give Shawn the floor and let him do his presentation here. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, Brittany and Kim. What fun this is. All right, so Madeline suggests I didn't have a title for my system. I don't really have a title yet, but I'm punting the descriptive assessment system because that's the best I can come up with right now. So how I approach talking about coffee is very different than how these other systems have done it. They are, they seem to have all been built on a sense of what a specific group of people were really interested in and believed in and really liked. And they created their evaluation system around their vision of coffee. My system is developed around sensory science principles and then trying to apply those to an everyday use. It doesn't always work perfectly, and there's certainly pukas in my system, but every time I can, I try to develop it a little bit better. So pretty simple. I'm going to sort of describe the core of the system, briefly how it works, and then everything everybody's been talking about, who used it, where is it used, what's good and bad about it. And please send me criticism and comments. Anything I can do to refine is always very, very welcome. So sort of a basic tenet of how I want to approach cupping is that I don't want it to be about me or the judge, the evaluation, excuse me, not the cupping. It should be about the people who are interacting with the coffee. And of course, in our industry, that lots of people. It can be farmers, it can be roasters or consumers, it can be retailers, it can be the person cupping, it can be a colleague. There's all sorts of people you can communicate with. And the reason why you're cupping might shift depending on why you're doing it, who you're talking to. And in a competition system, my system really needs to be informed by the stakeholders on a more individual basis. Right? Me as a cupper, oftentimes doing it at the request of somebody, it's sort of me informing what I think is important occasionally to the customer. What I think is totally necessary is that it has to be transparent to everybody. So what is it we're measuring? What are the characteristics? How are they being measured? What are the things that influence those choices that we make? It's sweet. How sweet is it? Or do I like sweet, or is it not sweet? In fact, that dichotomy of do I like it or how sweet it is perhaps the most important difference between my system and the system people have talked about. Sensory science is about it's about being instruments, right? We want to say this is what this object is, not necessarily how do we feel about it. And this is antithetical to how a human operates. We are trained as humans to like and feel and to interact with everything. And so asking a human to say, just tell me about this thing, don't tell me what you feel or think about it, is really tricky. And it doesn't happen perfectly in any situation. We're not machines. But I like to think we could aspire to that, so that we are being descriptive. We're creating a response to your coffee that is not about me, it's about the coffee. And I might hate the coffee, and I still might be able to describe it to you. And you might love the coffee, and I might hate it. There could be all kinds of differences. And it's not about, is one coffee better than the other? It's about, what is the coffee? And so everything that I do in my system is about what is the coffee? And consequently, how can I remove myself as a human from that? All right, so the things, people have been cupping coffee and tasting coffee for a long time. I haven't invented new words to use. That would be kind of silly, because as a group of people, we think that, body is important, sweetness is important, acidity is important. Characteristics, the core skeleton of a coffee, they're all very similar, right? Most systems use pretty much the same words with a couple of in and out here. And of course, descriptors, as Kim was saying, it's not just about what's the acidity of this coffee, but what's the romance, what's the detail, what makes this coffee different from another? How can we, what are the ideas and words and flavors and experiences that pertain to this coffee that don't pertain to others. So I don't think the sensory science perspective, you would enumerate those before you even start. In a industry setting, that's a little trickier. So I believe in free association for descriptors. Everything I do is measured on intensity. Right? Is it not there, or is it really, really there? And the only way to sort of train that or to use that with other people is to have reference standards. So, take some water, add some product X, and that X creates a scale for whatever that thing is, acidity or sweetness or bitterness, whatever you want to use. You can create a reference for it. And that's what World Coffee Research did with their lexicon, is try to establish standards for a lot of the things that we use. The problem is, intensity just means it's there, it's not there, how much of it is there. It doesn't convey any other content, for better and worse, actually. It also means that there's no score generated. You can't take up all these different intensities and add them together and generate anything meaningful. All you're saying is that, oh, this coffee has a lot of these things in it. So I don't create any scores whatsoever. It's all descriptive. It's there, it's not there, how much is it there? And that means that the cupper, it's actually pretty easy for the cupper, because you just learn to be the machine and you do it. The really hard part is communicating to somebody else, perhaps what that means, or for the consumer who's not used to these ideas. What does it mean to have a lot of acidity or low body? And the reality is any system requires training or knowledge of. So just because nobody knows my system doesn't make it any harder than any other system. It just means nobody's learned it yet. Of course, you can't really have a competition without a score. So I originally developed the system in a practical sense for a cupping competition in Kona a few years back. And of course, you have to have a competition, you have to have winners, so you have to have a score. So there is a way of adapting the essence of the system to have a score. It's a little more complicated how the score is generated and how we maintain the objectivity. And that's where some of the slippery parts of the system are that don't work as a well-oiled machine as I would like them to yet. One of the important details about that, of having a scoring system that's objective, that used to have a winner, is that you have to have something compared to. So in a competition, you have to say, look, this is what the winning coffee has to taste like. And then you can compare everything else to that. And we can certainly talk about implications of that later if you want. So this is the pretty dolled up version of my cupping sheet. It's dolled up because it was the one my publisher wanted to stick in my book. But it just lists all the attributes that I attend to. They're all familiar to you: dry aroma, wet aroma, and then an intensity scale, basically present or not present. On my one that I use in a professional setting, I don't have numbers indicating the different demarcations. It's all just anchor lines. That way there's less bias on my part for choosing a number. And then beneath the first section is all the places where I'd use the free-form descriptors. So, this is not a system anyone uses but me. I'm an independent consultant. I've been a scientist. I do sciencey stuff. So I use it in the context of when I need it. People hire me to taste their coffees. I use this system. I do my best to convey to them, here's how it works. Here's how it's different. Here's how it's not going to, you can't market this description the way you can market a 93. You have to put some more effort into internalizing and transforming this information as something that's useful. But it has a lot of value because it's not saying whether I like it or not. It's not saying to the farmer whether that farmer likes it or not, or if you're a roaster trying to convey, you're not saying it to your consumer whether you like it or not. You're saying this is what the coffee is. It's up to you to decide whether you like it or not. In a sense, the consumer has to know themselves and calibrate to themselves, whereas in the coffee review in the SCA system, the consumer has to calibrate to this sort of undefined, industry accepted system of worse to better, right? Higher numbers are better, and if you like it like we do, then you're going to like these higher numbers. I don't have any of that. So obviously, I think there's a lot of good in this system, which is why I do it, even though it prevents me from necessarily communicating easily with other coffee professionals about a coffee or other consumers. Thanks for the question, Thomas. I'll get to it in a little bit at the end. We'll come back to that. So strengths. It doesn't matter who's cupping. anybody can cup if you're calibrated to the reference standards. Doesn't care what, it doesn't matter whether you like acidity or not, or whether you like sour or not, or fruity or whatever. It's just the coffee is what it is, and you're just measuring things. Nobody has to figure out what the score means. Does 96 mean that one characteristic scored very lowly and the other scored very high? You don't have to try to dissect how much of the score is about the cupper liking that coffee or not. So you can use it for any coffee. It's very plain and transparent. It's all about describing. So as I really want to reiterate, it's not about liking. It's about, here's the description. You like it or you don't, and that's for you to decide, not for me to decide. And you don't need any knowledge of the coffee ahead of time. In fact, the less you know, the better off you are. Right? It's not just cupping blind. It's just being a machine. I keep coming back to that, and it sounds very cold and inhuman, which it is, and that's the whole point. But the role of the expert is not to say, I like this. The role of the expert is to say, this is what this is. Let me take you on this journey of discovery. And, we might like different things. And reality is coffee professionals, I think we all know this. We've all had coffees that we love that somebody else or consumer doesn't love. Remember the first time I tried the Panama Geisha when it first came out, 10, 15 years ago, more than that. The farmer I was tasting it with didn't like it. He said, how can I like this? It's not even coffee. It tastes like tea. And this is supposed to be the world's best coffee. It's the most expensive coffee, and yet he didn't like it. And he's a farmer. And that was pretty eye-awakening, right? We shouldn't be dictating to other people what they should be enjoying. So, to me, I find it to be a very strong, robust system in this regard. Of course, nobody knows about it, so I can give you a description of a coffee and some numbers, and if you don't understand the references that I have, if you don't know my reference scale, then you're sort of at a loss. Much as Kim celebrates, describing a coffee, it takes a lot of words. It's not a single number that says 97, and that just means a lot to somebody who knows what it means, but you've really got to work to encompass what the experience was without putting bias in there. If you've never cupped with me for a long time, then of course you have to train yourself to use the system and the references. But that's true of SCA system too, right? Britt described this brilliant example of Japanese and American Q graders actually having different regions of where they operate. Kim described how it took 6 months for her to sort of calibrate herself to the group that was already existing. So any system requires calibration and learning. But since I'm the one who uses mine and I think it's great, I have to convince the whole world that there's something valuable to it. I thought the system worked great in the competition that I designed it for. It's not perfect. It definitely needs some modifications to make it smoother and easier and to be a little more versatile. But there's a lot of promise. And probably the biggest problem with the system is that it just loses the gestalt of the coffee, the essence. It doesn't, is a coffee more than the sum of its parts, right? I have a sum of parts, and it's really tricky to convey that experience to somebody else. Right? Both the other two systems we heard from today have a way of saying, look, here's my expertise. Here's how it fits into my worldview of coffee. There's some value in that, and I don't have a solution for that. It's antithetical to my system, but yet there's a lot of value there, especially when conveying with consumers and anybody else. So that's all I have. I wanted to be really quick because I'm more interested in discussion and Q&A than I am about details. But I reiterate, please ask as many questions and be as critical as you want. The more I can fine tune it, the happier I'm going to be. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
You have I kind of assumed you would probably have the most just because people are least familiar with your system. And so
surprise.
But the first question that Tom asks here is, how do you rate coffeeness, and how do we describe that?
That's it. So coffeeness is something I only recently came to. I came to it for the competition, actually, when I designed the system. So most coffee forms use the term flavor on their forms. And I grew up in coffee evaluation in a sensory science lab at university. And we couldn't use things that were not clear and distinct. And as I sort of dived into the industry, the word flavor can mean lots of things. It can mean, our paradigm of what coffee is. It can mean blueberry. It can mean amalgamation of different things, the whole experience of the coffee. Like, it's just not a very clear word. And I use it to mean the essence of coffee, right? When someone thinks of coffee, what does that mean, right? Scientists years ago, decades ago, came up with almost 30 different aroma compounds that make us think, oh, this is the smell of coffee. There's an idea of what people have for coffee. So coffeeness is that paradigm. Like, what is it we think of when we think of a cup of coffee? And so when you rate that, you're just rating the amount of coffee, right? And that's almost always going to be in contrast to some other things, right? If you have a lot of lemon flavor in your coffee, you're going to have a little bit of coffeeness because the lemon flavor is going to overpower that sense of coffeeness, right? Geisha, it doesn't taste like coffee at all, it tastes like tea, right? So maybe it's going to have no coffeeness. And I think that's really useful in talking to consumers and other people about what is this coffee really going to be like? How much of it is coffee and how much of it is this dreamy, geeky, complex, whatever? This is where I find the struggle with the other systems, is that they celebrate what someone likes about the coffee, but so many customers just don't appreciate that or get that, and there's a miscommunication. Now, if you have a niche group of consumers like Coffee Review does, then you're fine. Everyone's calibrated and the system works beautifully. I run a farmer's market booth, and I have customers all across the board who don't know this system, or you don't know anything about coffee world, and they just want coffees they can interact with. So terminology has to match them as well as it's going to match any one of you experts listening, because there's a big group of us out there, and we're not just talking to one small group of people anymore.
Well, just to comment on that, we use, or I actually will use, the descriptor coffeeness.
That's cool.
There are, of its coffee, and so we have definitely started to use that word a little bit, just in that general idea of what we think of coffee tasting like. Kind of following up on that, because you're not getting scores from your system, being more or less of one of these attributes isn't necessarily a good or bad thing. Is that correct? Okay.
Correct. Coffees aren't good or bad. They're different.
I love this approach because I don't really think that pleasure needs to always be quantified. Your system is really interesting to me. It seems sort of like the Oberlin of systems, because you're having all the experiences, without the brain.
You can see that.
And I really enjoy that. What we try to do at Coffee Review, and you're right on when you say that, like, we have a sort of niche audience. We do try to use language to describe caveats for people, but it is very difficult to then apply a numerical rating to those. So, for example, I have to write all these reviews, and when we as a group give a coffee a 93 score, obviously a good score, I have to write the review, and maybe I didn't personally like that coffee, but I've got all these notes of boysenberry and sandalwood and cannabis and hop flowers and all that stuff. And maybe I didn't really love the coffee, but I have to, as you say, sort of be a vessel for explaining the sensory experience of it. That was a shared experience. But the numerical stuff really does get in the way, because it really only makes sense to you if you like the coffee. So if that's why we try to add the caveat language. This is for people who really prefer tea. We say that sort of thing a lot for that reason.
Yeah, there's no perfect way of doing this. That's sort of what's so frustrating as a trained scientist, right? I want everything to fit in the right kind of box, and we should be able to design it and have it work for everybody, but it doesn't work that way.
Shawn, we have a couple more questions here. Do you have an example of how you transform this data to consumer-ready information? Basically, from your evaluation, how do you then present that in a consumer-friendly way? Or is it just these like one-on-one conversations?
So there's two ways of dealing with it. One is, most of how I use this is with someone who hires me to evaluate their coffee. So they get a report, right? And the report has, all the numbers. And, within my cupping system, I have various replications and ways of making a little more sciencey, a little more robust data set. But you get the numbers of what happens for each of the characteristics, any flavors that I come up with, and then as much text as I can come up with to create context around there. And, my farmer's market, I'm just going to rely on that as my best example. I try to always have a geeky coffee, which is something that tends to be acidy and complex, and something a little more high in coffeeness, a little more simple, coffee forward. And I know what these coffees are, whether I cupped them or just brewed them and tasted them. So I have a sense of what they might be like. And it's interacting with the consumers, it's about interacting with their construct, right? I bet most people who are listening to this right now have struggled with the use of the word strong, or powerful, or dark. I mean, consumers use all kinds of words that have a very specific meaning to them, but not to us. So, within my system, having the parts of the coffee, the characteristics sort of broken out into discrete ideas, it really helps communicate with the consumer, trying to suss out what is it they are actually interested in talking about. So they might not be interested in sweetness or acidity, or they are really interested in acidity, whether they call it bitterness or acidity. Like, they really care about it, and it's important to use that word to understand what they understand. I would love to say that I have a bustling roastery cafe with lots of people coming through it, and I'm using this system. That was always one of the challenges with Daylight Mind, was how do I make this practical on a large scale? That's one of its challenges. It's a little less practical.
Wrong.
Hold on, you're choppy. I can't hear anything you're saying, Madeline.
Okay.
A little bit, yeah.
I like your use of the example of the word strong, because whenever I have anybody saying to me, I like a strong coffee, I always follow that up with, what do you mean by that? Let's talk about what you mean by that, so I can better understand what you're actually trying to say to me. Because it does mean, those words do mean different things to different people. So do you have plans to maybe find a way to scale up the method used for communicating what these evaluations mean in your system? It's an ongoing process?
Yes and no. So I'm moving into a new business aspect where I'm going to have the ability to describe coffees to consumers. They can select them. And so I'm going to try to do this very thing, right? Here's my cupping evaluation of it, or my evaluation of it. How am I going to translate that to a consumer? My sense is that numbers will be dropped entirely. I think if we look at the specialty coffee scale, 80 to 100, we can delineate numbers, groups of those numbers that there's just natural variation of. So an 81 could be an 83, depending on who's doing it in the day of the week. Is it 81 to 84? Is it 85 to 87? Whatever it is, we could create, coffee response boxes or appreciation scales, whatever you want to call it. Like, we could transform 20 numbers into 3 to 5 different categories. And I think what I'll probably try to do is take my scoring response and create a box for those things to play in. Because ultimately, an 82 is not necessarily as important as this is a very coffee-forward coffee. Like, I find that to be a much more useful tool for people. This is always my vision at Daylight Mind, but we just never got around to it. Is creating this, here's a description. What does it mean in a practical sense? And limiting what that practical sense could be. But of course, once you start limiting things, then things don't have houses to play in. So yes, ongoing development, but that's, I think, the road I'm going to take.
Do you use World Coffee Research's sensory lexicon for intensity references, or have you come up with your own? Obviously the SCA form does use that. I actually wonder if Coffee Review's form does as well.
So the WCR references are spectacular, largely because somebody else came up with them and I didn't have to. I have come up with some of those similar ones on my own. So there's a lot of overlap. The biggest struggle I have with the WCR lexicon, and I don't know why K-State did this when they designed it, was that their references work on a scale from 1 to 15, when everybody in the industry works on a scale of 1 to 10. So what I do is that I take the reference material, whether it's citric acid or strawberry jam, whatever it is, and to recreate a reference that works to my 1 to 10 scale. And if they have numbers, which they do for some of the things, right? They use 0.1% malic acid. You can just I try to translate that in some mathematical way to a 1 to 10 scale. But yeah, why reinvent a wheel that somebody's already put a lot of good effort into? And I've ditched things. I've ditched things I'd come up with because theirs were better. So yeah, it makes sense to use their industry heft to follow their lead.
And Kim, do you all kind of use that? I mean, you're everybody's Q graders, so I assume you would be using the same lexicon as a reference point.
We do, but we also feel free to, we use a lot of descriptors in our notes that are not always reflected in the final reviews, and we have arguments all the time about what of our descriptors are accessible or not to readers. Ken is always pushing for the broadest range of accessibility, and Jason or I might say, well, that really, really, really is ginseng. Like, it can't be translated. It's ginseng, And so we go far beyond that WCR lexicon, but it really does sort of form the base of our discussion, and it encompasses most of what ends up in print. But a lot of other language gets shared on a daily basis.
What are the biggest changes
You're breaking up again. Can you please repeat your question?
Can you hear me better now, maybe?
Yes, it's better now.
Okay. I'm not doing anything differently, so I don't know why. But there's a question here that I think is just good for everybody on the panel to address and think about, which is, what are the biggest changes you've seen in the industry, scoring and tasting in your tenure in the industry, and what most would you like to see change next?
Industry for 5 years. The biggest change I've seen is this sort of the same way with universities. Again, the grade inflation. I think scores are going up. I don't necessarily have an opinion about that. I tend to assume it's because coffee quality is also going up. In terms of the trends that I see in the samples we get, lately it's all been about the alternative processing methods, the anaerobics, the yeast processes, all the funkadelic things that people are doing to coffees that are so fascinating. A lot of that experimental work is going on in Hawaii. I know a lot of what we get comes from the islands. Those are the two observations I've made. Roasters out there are always looking, and producers too, I think, are always looking for ways to differentiate their coffee from other people's coffee. And that explains that one change for me.
Go for it, Britt.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the same line as Kim. I would love to see the way that we score coffees and talk about coffees to have more openness and flexibility for new technology and processing methods. And the industry is changing a lot between how global warming is changing, where coffee can be grown. We're going to see a lot of things continue to evolve. And so I think there needs to be a lot more flexibility and that includes within the Specialty Coffee Association CQI system, to adapt to those changes.
My eyes first started opening to specialty coffee system, specialty coffee, when specialty coffee was just becoming identifiable. So around 2000, plus or minus a couple of years. And back then there was only really one voice, Specialty Coffee Association of America, and they were doing great work. And they were trying to bring together a very disparate industry to have some alignment. And that was hugely important and influential. But they've got this really big umbrella now. And that's great because it means lots of different people come together, but it's not so great because it means lots of different opinions. What I think I've seen, what I think is going to keep happening is that people are, in this example of coffee evaluation, that people are going to learn this system, the main system, and then adapt it. I found probably, 7 to 10 other systems that people have published about online, other blogs, other companies, that have some really compelling nuances that really work for them. And we have to return to the question of, who and what are we doing this for? Originally it was about talking to other professionals, and it became talking to farmers, and then it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I think we're going to see diversification of systems and things that are important. I would like to think we're going to see a lower reliance on we like this, therefore you should like it kind of attitudes. But that's wishful thinking on my part.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that, I don't want to suggest that scores don't matter at all, or that all of this is, is meaningless, but every coffee has a home. Understanding the market, where it's going, who wants to drink your coffee, I think is extremely important to understand, rather than worrying about what the number is associated with the coffee. I think it can be really damaging, and I think it can be really limiting. I think the most important thing is that producers are selling their coffees and making a livable wage off of that sale. And so I think that should be really the greatest goal that we have as associates in the industry. That's my beauty pageant answer. I don't think we can hear you, Madeline.
There is a question from Shawn about how you developed the heritage profile in that Kona cupping competition a few years ago, and your system is, as you said, it's kind of it's based around developing a profile or a goal, or I guess not a goal. I don't know what the right word is, but
a definition.
Definition. There you go. And so, yeah, just curious to know what that process was like.
Of all the things that I developed for that competition, this solution is the one I'm really most proud about. So if you're just describing a coffee, as I said, you can't say this one's better than the other. What you can do is compare one coffee to another, right? And that's really what we mean by quality, right? Is how does this compare to some standard, some paradigm that we have in our heads? Well, who am I to say what a winning coffee should be in a competition? Maybe, I have a great resume for coffee, right? Maybe I'm a good person, but it's not my competition. It's everybody's competition, right? It's for the farmers, right? And it's for the consumers who want to find the farmer's coffee. Lots of people who are engaging in this competition. So my whole goal was to get as many stakeholders as I could together. Now, that does not mean every farmer and every consumer and every person who's going to attend the festival. I try to get a breadth of the people who are relevant to the competition. So the sponsors, the farmers, the judges, people are going to be volunteering. Probably about 10 people. And we all had an email chain over a couple of weeks of trying to decide what is the definition of this coffee, right? The classic Kona idea from 50 years ago. And what do we want a modern geeky specialty coffee profile to be? And we hashed it out, and everybody had a say. And the next year's competition could be different, right? It can differ at any moment. And right, the beauty of my system is that it's, if you want to compare, you create what you compare to. And the way mathematics of the system work, it's really super to calculate out a score. But it's never about what I want, it's what the group wants. And that to me is a really powerful tool.
Yeah, and just to let folks know too, in the years following the time when Shawn hosted the competition, PCR has adopted part of his method in the Kona Cupping competition to accommodate that profile, because we're looking at a defined profile and trying to find the coffee that fits that. And so we enjoy the use of that system as well in okay, we're trying to find the coffee that tastes most like this. And that's the goal. And it is a learning curve. As somebody who's cupped on that panel, it was a learning curve. And it's interesting though, I find it fascinating. And every year when we do come back to that, it's, you just kind of calibrate with each other and explain to the rest of the panel what it's like. So it's definitely useful. And yeah, so thank you for that. Okay, with just a few minutes to spare, I am going to just close out the Q&A session here. But I want to say thank you to everybody who joined us, and especially mahalo to Britt, Kim, and Shawn for just this great presentation and this great discussion, really. And additionally, especially to our sponsors who've helped us out with this webinar series. We have Savor Brands based in Honolulu as our platinum sponsor, Bendig as our gold sponsor, Lind Insurance as silver, and Downtown Coffee Honolulu as our silver sponsor as well. Additionally, for anybody who wants to look back at this video, they will all be available on the HCA website. Every webinar actually will be available on the HCA website. It just takes a few minutes for the video to render, and it's available almost immediately. So if you missed a part or you want to share it with somebody, feel free to send them to this link that I just posted in the chat box. And thank you for joining us. If you are interested in supporting HCA in the future, go ahead and go to our Support Us page and help us out there. We would love to continue doing more events like this in the future and, just navigate this virtual world that we're all working in now and still bring important information to everybody. Mahalo for joining, and have a lovely afternoon, everyone.